should be contemplative, reverent, and sincere. This is the unspoken assumption that is taken as read by all serious poets and educational institutions. I believe this urgently needs to be challenged. We should celebrate and examine the central role that humour, revelry, and debauchery even has played within poetry. And in this podcast, that is exactly what I'm going to do. I will give evidence to show that comedy is intrinsic to poetry and performance, and by extension, the oral tradition more broadly. And not only that, but that comedy is intrinsic to the British poetic experience. I'm also going to draw on the work of some philosophers that can help us understand a little clearer as to why that might be. First, I'd like to thank my Patreons who have made the research and the recording of these podcasts possible. This is part of a series of podcasts about the craft of live performance and more broadly language and the human psyche. And I'm reflecting on my work as an author, my research as an author, and my work as a poet. It's also hosted on the Pete the Temp YouTube channel under the playlist Talks, Podcasts and Workshops. So please take a moment to subscribe to that so I can send you those and you can get them in your feed. So comedy, live performance comedy. Let's have a look first at this relationship. Something I signposted in a recent podcast on swearing called The Importance of Swearing in Poetry is that in performance you can take more risks in a way that is often discouraged by broadcasters and publishers who are publishing to audiences at a distance, right? In the live setting, unlike with a book, for example, you know the crowd, maybe you've just had a beer with the crowd, you're in direct, real-time feedback with that audience, and you can read the vibe in the room. So you can tell which jokes you can land, you can be more risky because you know what you can get away with. Ludwig Wittgenstein, the Austrian philosopher, famously talked about the game of language. He argued that language can't be considered outside of the actions into which it is woven. That is to say that context is everything. Different social exchanges are like games or rituals with accepted rules that shape what we can say, how we say it, and how we interpret what is being said. For example, if I walked in the room and started shouting that there's a fire, that would understandably cause alarm. If I walked in and I was dressed as a clown, maybe that wouldn't cause alarm, but maybe it would necessarily so. Maybe there is actually a fire. But if you were in a theatre and I walked on stage as a clown shouting fire, then so you get how there is, through the social context and the geographical location within which language happens, there is a complicity and a conspiracy in the context of comedy to the way that laughter circulates through the room. You could describe it as a kind of consented risk-taking, and it's a subtle and shifting interplay, and this makes up the contract between the stage and the auditorium. Now, one of the things I love about my craft, spoken word poetry, is that it has such a broad range of experiences. It can be factual, like journalism, it can be emotional, like theatre, and it can be funny, like comedy. All of these things come together in a poem when it's performed. So when I'm orchestrating a set, I can deploy humour at certain intervals to create shifts of tone, and this can stop things being too heavy. These shifts engage different registers of the brain and the body and help to regulate the attentional resources of the audiences that I'm performing to. And it does this by creating dynamics and surprises, setup, punchline, heavy, light, sincere, silly, right? Within performance, this is what makes comedy so vital, I think. This idea, incidentally, of regulating the experience of the audience is something that I've borrowed from Julia Novak in her very fabulous book, Live Poetry. So if you're interested in geeking out on that, I do recommend getting yourself a copy of that book. These techniques, of course, are really, really old and can be seen throughout the oral tradition. Before the time of printing, audio recording, or professional newscasting, the spoken or the sung voice was the principal means by which news, gossip, current affairs, and entertainment was transmitted. In Europe, between the Renaissance and the Industrial Revolution, all of these things came together in the verbal artistry of the ballad singer. The ballad singer was the means by which the vast majority of ordinary people got their current affairs and their live entertainment as well. It was performative, it was titillating, it was funny, and it was all made palatable to the listener by stories, poems, and songs. Now, this need for poetry to work the crowd didn't dissolve when the oral tradition gave way to mass literacy and when reading and writing became more widespread. One early text on poetry and performance by Alice Hasluck, great name, in 1946 argues that, and I quote, though reciters may have the laudable ambition to instruct and elevate, they may not forget the first mission of the drama, which is to entertain. Otherwise, their performances are apt to become tedious, unquote. Anyone who has been to a poetry event may know all too well what happens to the human nervous system when it is submitted to the sincere and the serious for too long. It begins to feel like church, right? So this refined contemplative fad of the lyric poem, which is really popular at the moment, is only part of what poetry is and always has been. And again through history, we can find examples to back this up. For example, during the 1910s in Switzerland's infamous Cabaret Voltaire, where Dada sound poetry was born, you would have really bawdy, carnivalesque cabarets. Hans Arp, one of the poets of that time, describes one of these, what's happening on stage during one of these cabarets, and I quote again, "Total pandemonium. The people around us are shouting, laughing and gesticulating. Zara is wriggling his behind like the belly of an oriental dancer. Madame Hennings, with a famous Madonna face, is doing the splits. Hulsenbeck is banging away non-stop on the great drum," unquote. And the poetry of the Dada era existed in these types of environments, which I think is an interesting contrast to what we often associate with poetry, right? Cabaret variety performance has long been a big part of the poetic tradition of this country as well. For about 70 years, a huge period between the mid-19th century and the end of the First World War, the variety entertainment of music hall cabarets were the very fabric of popular culture in this country. We can see this in the poetry of people like John Betjeman, which was funny, it was accessible, it was performative poetry. Jumping forward now to the 1980s, another really significant time for cabaret here. And we're now looking at a direct evolutionary precursor to UK spoken word. You have what came to be known as alternative cabarets. These were kind of DIY anarchic affairs with a kind of have-a-go ethos that kicked off in London, as I say, during the 1980s. You had performance poets like Benjamin Zephaniah, John Hegley, Porky the Poet, now Phil Jupitus, Simon Munnery, and Mark Millwards, to name just a few. All of these were showmen. They were all comics as well as poets, right? And they were sharing stages with comedians like Stuart Lee, Rory Bremner, Rick Mail, French and Saunders, and many others. And it is the alternative cabaret era that gave us what we now know to be stand-up poetry. Stand-up poetry is a syncretic subgenre of live literature which fuses stand-up poetry with poetry, stand-up comedy with poetry and performance. It's a culture, it's a craft, it has its own history, its own canon, and it has received almost zero attention from academia. Kate Fox is a poet and an academic that is an exception to this rule. I'm going to mention her a bit later on. But yeah, stand-up poetry, it is part of what poetry is here, and it is part of what comedy is. And what a proud tradition of comedy we have in this country. Comedy is I think, one of Britain's greatest cultural refinements. We don't have many, so we need to grasp on to as many as we can get. In the same way that Italians have a well-developed taste for clothes and the French have a well-developed taste for food, Britons, I think, have a very cultivated sense of humour. As an Englishman, I am unable not to be silly. Humour is the cultural filter through which I mediate the world. In his Vorticist manifesto of 1914, the North American poet Ezra Pound writes, and I quote again, "Bless English humour. Any great northern art will partake of this insidious and volcanic chaos." Pound argues that humour is a sensibility. It's a way of moving through the world that blasts through repressed Victorian social decorum. And it is this very repression, this stiff upper lippedness, that energizes what he calls the ferocious chemistry of laughter. So given what we know about how central humour is to the history of poetry and how it's particular to British poetry, why is it that it has been so sidelined in the study of poetry? I want to end by touching on some philosophy that will shed some light on this. The first one is Friedrich Nietzsche, who talked about what he called the spirit of seriousness that has grown out of the Christian church and infected academia. Now, it won't be a surprise for any of you to learn that the European church has always had a problem with sex, laughter, revelry and dancing. It was the medieval church that put seats in churches to stop people from dancing. And it was the medieval church that pushed the carnival out of the church and into the street. And we can also see this in academia, right? This same culture throughout the centuries where universities were evolving. You had this same cultural norm, right? Where there is still to this day this assumption that in order to be credible, you must be serious. You can't be laughable, you can't be fun, you can't be funny if you are a serious academic. What has this got to do with poetry? I'm going to come back to that after this little digression in just a moment. But another philosopher, the French philosopher Michel Foucault, riffed on this idea, Nietzsche's idea of the spirit of seriousness. And he argued that the elite are able to get people to self-police their behaviour by getting them to absorb the values and perceptions of that elite. And this is exactly what has happened, I believe, in the world of poetry. The poetry establishment has lots of careers invested in the lie that poetry is highbrow, serious, and inaccessible. The cabaret tradition of variety entertainment shows us that silly and irreverent poetry is a craft, and a complex craft, and an innovative craft at that. Poetry is inextricable from laughter, and funny poetry is inextricable from Britishness. Poetry has everything to do with carnivalesque transgression. They're really the main points I want to make, but I think it's really important also to say, to shout out some of my favourite stand-up poets, so you can check them out for yourself. Kate Fox is one, and she's also written as an academic on the subject of stand-up poetry. Salena Godden, Anna Freeman, Thick Richard, Jonny Fluffypunk is another one, and the absurdist prop-wielding poet Rob Orton I think is very much close to that kind of cabaret tradition. And me and Rob actually used to go to comedy open mics and cabarets in London in the early part of this century, actually, when we were both starting out. In the blurb below, there are show notes with references to other poets. I should also mention that that list is not exhaustive. In fact, it's almost impossible to find a poet on stage that doesn't do comedy in some way or another. Those poets that I've mentioned are kind of like, that's their main thing. They're principally comic poets. But so many poets are using it, again, because it's so integrated into the fabric of what poetry is on stages, at least in this country. So in the blurb below, I've put show notes with references to the other poets and the writers and the quotations that I've mentioned. Please take a moment to check out the Patreon link that is there, to check out what free stuff you'll get in return, including books of mine, for supporting this podcast. So please take a moment to check that out. Subscribe to this, hit the notifications button, and please like, share and comment would also be really useful. If you want to go deeper into this, I have written a book about all of this. It's called Stage Invasion, published by Outspoken Press, and you can get that online. Thanks for listening.